The airport thrummed with life, a symphony of hurried footsteps tapping against the polished floors, the low rumble of suitcase wheels gliding across aisles, and the intermittent crackle of announcements spilling from overhead speakers. Naomi Carter stood in the first-class check-in line, her fingers adjusting the strap of her leather tote bag as it rested against her shoulder. Her warm brown eyes flicked to her phone, tracing over her itinerary for what felt like the 100th time that morning. This wasn't just another flight, it was a milestone. She'd poured months into preparing her keynote address for the Global Summit on Business Innovation, an event that had chosen her, the first black woman to take its stage as the headliner. The weight of that honor pressed against her chest, not as a burden, but as a quiet fire fueling her determination. Miss Carter, the voice of the check-in agent, a young man with a bright smile and an easy demeanor, broke through her reverie. Naomi stepped forward, offering a polite nod as she handed over her ticket. The agent's eyes lingered on her for a split-second curiosity, maybe, or a flicker of surprise before he smoothed it over with professionalism. "First class, all set. Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter," he said, returning her boarding pass with a practiced grin. "Thank you," she replied, tucking the pass into her purse as she turned away. She wasn't blind to the subtle double-take she sometimes drew in places like this. Dressed in her understated navy blazer, tailored slacks, and simple gold jewelry, elegant, but never ostentatious. It was a look that mirrored her, poised, purposeful, and unapologetic. Yet those fleeting glances were a reminder of the quiet assumptions she'd learned to navigate over the years. As she moved through security, Naomi drew a slow breath, steadying herself. This trip wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was about seizing an opportunity. She'd earned through sleepless nights and relentless effort. By the time she reached Gate 14, the terminal had softened into a quieter hum. She arrived early, as always, settling into a cushioned seat by the window. The morning light streamed through the glass, catching the faint shimmer of her wedding ring as she pulled her tablet from her bag to review her slides. That ring was more than a symbol of her marriage to Jonathan, it was an anchor, a quiet reassurance that even on solo journeys like this, she was never truly alone. She smiled faintly at the thought, her husband's words echoing in her mind, "You've got this, Nye. Always." The boarding call crackled through the air, pulling her from her notes. Naomi rose, smoothing her blazer as she joined the priority line. Around her, the chatter of passengers blended into a dull murmur. But one voice sliced through the noise, sharp and unexpected. "Are you sure this is the first-class line?" She turned to find a man in a crisp pilot's uniform staring at her, his silver hair swept back neatly, his blue eyes narrowing with something that felt like suspicion. Naomi met his gaze evenly, holding up her boarding pass. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but firm. He didn't reply at first, his eyes darting from her face to the ticket in her hand. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken tension, before he gave a curt nod. "Enjoy your flight," he muttered, stepping aside. His tone carried an edgy challenge, perhaps that prickled at the back of her neck. She clenched her jaw but said nothing, refusing to let it unravel her composure. The first-class cabin greeted her with an air of understated luxury, plush cream seats, wide armrests, and a faint scent of leather and citrus. Naomi found her spot to a window seat and settled in, sliding her tote bag beneath the chair with practiced ease. She was arranging her things when that same voice jolted her again. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." She straightened, her pulse quickening as she faced the pilot once more. He stood in the aisle, arms crossed, his posture rigid with authority. A few passengers nearby glanced over, their faces a mix of curiosity and mild amusement. "Is there an issue?" Naomi asked, keeping her tone steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "Yes," he replied, his voice clipped and unyielding. "There's been a mistake. This seat isn't yours." Her brow furrowed as she reached for her boarding pass, holding it out. "This is 2A, and my ticket clearly says." "I'm aware of what the ticket says," he cut in, his words sharp enough to slice through her sentence. "But I'm asking you to step aside while we sort this out." The cabin grew quieter, the rustle of whispers spreading like wildfire. Naomi's cheeks flushed, but she refused to shrink. "There's nothing to sort out," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." The pilot's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to move, or I'll have to involve security." The threat landed like a stone, heavy and cold. Naomi took a deep breath, her mind racing, but her resolve ironclad. "You're welcome to call them," she said, sliding into her seat with deliberate calm. "But I'm not going anywhere." The air thickened with tension as the pilot turned away. His muttered words lost beneath his breath. Moments later, two security officers appeared at the cabin door, their boots thudding softly against the carpet. The taller one, a man with a furrowed brow and an apologetic tilt to his mouth, spoke first. "Ma'am, we've been asked to escort you off the plane." "For what reason?" Naomi asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "There's a dispute about your seat," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. "There's no dispute," she countered, holding up her ticket like a shield. "This seat is mine." "Are you asking me to leave because I'm black?" The question cut through the air, sharp and unflinching. The officers exchanged a glance, their unease palpable, but before they could respond, the pilot stormed back, his face flushed with indignation. "This isn't about race," he snapped. "It's about following protocol." "Your protocol seems awfully selective," Naomi shot back, rising to her feet now. Her voice trembled with the weight of years spent facing down moments like this moments, where she had to summon grace and steel in equal measure. "If I were anyone else, would you be questioning my right to be here?" The pilot opened his mouth, but before he could retort, a new voice broke through the fray, deep, commanding, and laced with quiet fury. "What's going on here?" Head swiveled as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the cabin. His tailored suit hugged his frame, and though his expression remained calm, his dark eyes burned with intensity. Naomi's heart leaped relief, shock, and a flicker of pride crashing together. "Jonathan." The pilot faltered, his bravado wavering. "This doesn't concern you, sir," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. "Oh, but it does," Jonathan replied, his tone low and dangerous. He reached into his jacket, pulling out an ID badge and holding it up for the pilot to see. The color drained from the man's face as he read the title, Jonathan Carter, Executive Vice President, North American Operations, SkyConnect Airlines. The cabin fell silent, the hum of the plane's ventilation, the only sound threading through the stillness. Jonathan slipped the badge back into his pocket with deliberate care, his gaze never leaving the pilot's. Naomi watched, her breath caught in her chest, as her husband stood like a storm held in check, calm on the surface, but radiating a force that demanded reckoning. The passengers leaned forward, their eyes wide, waiting for the next move. The security officers shifted awkwardly, caught between duty and the dawning realization that they'd stepped into something far bigger than a seating dispute. In that moment, the lesson crystallized just for Naomi, but for everyone watching. Justice wasn't a passive gift. It was a fire that had to be stoked, a stand that had to be taken. Even at 30,000 feet, the pilot's abuse of power, rooted in prejudice and unchecked arrogance, had unraveled in the face of truth. And as Jonathan's presence shifted the tide, it became clear that the consequences of wielding authority unjustly could be swift and unforgiving. The man who'd thought he held all the cards was about to learn that real power lay not in titles or uniforms, but in the courage to confront what's wrong and the resolve to see it through. The air inside the cramped airplane cabin buzzed with a restless tension, thick enough to choke on. Naomi stood beside her first-class seat, her posture rigid yet regal, a storm of emotions swirling beneath her composed exterior. Relief flooded her chest like a cool tide when she caught sight of Jonathan, striding down the aisle toward her, his familiar silhouette cutting through the chaos like a beacon. She hadn't expected him here, not today. Not in this moment, but his presence was a lifeline she hadn't realized she'd been grasping for. Yet, beneath that relief simmered a molten anger, sharp and unrelenting, fueled by the sheer indignity of being forced to justify her right to a space she'd earned 10 times over. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the quiet fury of having her dignity dragged through the mud. In front of strangers, Jonathan, her husband, wasn't just a man, it was a force of nature. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that filled any room. He carried himself with the kind of effortless authority that made people instinctively straighten up. Today was no exception. His dark eyes swept the scene with surgical precision. The pilot, Captain Jack Thornton, standing stiff as a board, his uniform crisp but his confidence visibly fraying, and the two security officers, shifting their weight from foot to foot, their unease radiating like heat off asphalt. The cabin lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, amplifying the awkwardness of the standoff. "Would someone care to enlighten me?" Jonathan began, his voice low and steady, a velvet glove over an iron fist, "as to why my wife is being treated like an intruder in a seat that belongs to her." His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be carried a weight that pressed down on everyone within earshot, demanding answers without ever raising the volume. Captain Thornton squared his shoulders, a futile attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his voice tinged with a defensiveness he couldn't quite mask. "Mr. Carter, this is just a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There was a minor issue with the passenger's ticket, nothing more." His hands twitched at his sides, betraying the calm he was trying to project. Jonathan's expression didn't flicker, but his tone sharpened like a blade sliding from its sheath. "There's no issue with her ticket." He reached for Naomi's boarding pass, which she handed over silently, their fingers brushing briefly in a moment of unspoken solidarity. Holding it aloft, he turned it toward the cabin, letting the bold print of first class Seat 2A gleam under the overhead lights. "This says it all right here. If anyone's misunderstood something, Captain, it's you." Thornton's jaw clenched so hard Naomi could almost hear his teeth grinding. He wasn't a small man, but under Jonathan's gaze, he seemed to shrink. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple, catching the light as he struggled to hold his ground. "I was following protocol," he insisted, his voice tight as a bowstring. "We have to verify that passengers are in their assigned seats. It's standard procedure." Jonathan tilted his head, letting the pilot's words hang in the air like a noose tightening around Thornton's neck. "And you decided my wife didn't belong here because..." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. His piercing stare pinned Thornton in place, daring him to fill the silence with something other than excuses. The pilot faltered, his eyes darting to Naomi for a split second before flitting to the rows of passengers. Watching the drama unfold, the cabin felt smaller with every passing second, the air growing heavy with anticipation. Thornton's lips parted, then closed, his hesitation louder than any confession. "I acted on the information I had at the time," he finally muttered, sidestepping the real question with the grace of a man stumbling over his own feet. Jonathan took a single, deliberate step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over the pilot. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as his voice lowered to a near growl, each word dripping with controlled menace. "Let me make something crystal clear. My wife doesn't just belong. Has fought harder than most people on this plane to earn her place. What she doesn't deserve is to be humiliated in public by someone who ought to know better." A murmur rippled through the cabin, a low hum of agreement swelling among the passengers. Naomi felt their eyes on her, some filled with quiet sympathy, others glinting with curiosity. She stood taller, her chin lifted, her poise unshaken despite the storm raging inside her. This wasn't the first time she'd faced a challenge like this, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But with Jonathan beside her, his strength bolstering hers, she felt an unexpected surge of resilience. Her hands, still trembling faintly, clasped together in front of her, a small anchor against the tide of emotions threatening to pull her under. The two security officers exchanged a nervous glance, their polished badges glinting faintly under the cabin lights. The taller one, a weary man with a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat, his voice cautious but firm. "Mr. Carter, we were just called in to de-escalate things. If there's no problem with Mrs. Carter's ticket, we're happy to step back." His partner, shorter and stockier, nodded quickly, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his uniform jacket. "They weren't here to pick a fight, they were just pawns caught in someone else's game." Jonathan gave them a curt nod, his eyes never leaving Thornton. "You're dismissed." The officers didn't hesitate, retreating toward the front of the plane, with the speed of men eager to escape a sinking ship. Their heavy footsteps echoed briefly before fading into the hum of the engines warming up outside. Turning back to Thornton, Jonathan's gaze hardened, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Why did you single out my wife?" The question landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the cabin. Thornton's face flushed a deep crimson, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own silence. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the truth dangling just out of reach, too ugly to admit, too obvious to deny. Naomi stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a bell ringing in a storm. It was steady, but laced with the frustration she'd been holding back since this ordeal began. "Captain Thornton, let's not drag this out any longer. If you've got an accusation to make, say it outright. But know this, he won't be intimidated, and I won't be silenced." Her words carried a quiet power, resonating with the passengers around her. A few nodded in silent support, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and indignation on her behalf. Thornton shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes scuffing the carpeted floor. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. He started to respond, his voice a weak croak, when a new voice sliced through the air, sharp and unexpected. "This isn't the first time he's pulled something like this," a woman declared from across the aisle. All heads swiveled toward seat 3C, where a middle-aged woman sat, her stern face framed by a cascade of silver-streaked hair. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the armrests as she fixed Thornton with a withering glare. "I've flown with this airline for years, and I've seen him do it before, questioning people like her. Always subtle, always careful, but it's a pattern." Thornton's eyes widened, panic flashing across his features. "That's completely unfounded." He sputtered, his voice cracking under the strain. "Is it?" Jonathan cut in, his tone lethal, his eyes burning with a quiet fury that promised retribution. "Because if there's a pattern here, Captain, I'll dig until I find every last shred of it." His words were a vow, a promise etched in stone, and the passengers felt it. Whispers erupted around them, some recalling their own uneasy encounters with Thornton, others voicing quiet support for Naomi. The tide had turned, and Thornton stood alone, a man drowning in the consequences of his own making. Jonathan straightened, his voice ringing out with unshakable finality. "Captain Thornton, you're relieved of your duties, effective immediately. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline's board, and I'll personally see to it that this incident is investigated down to the smallest detail." Thornton's face drained of color, his mouth working soundlessly. "You can't," he began, but Jonathan silenced him with a look. "Oh, I can," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I will." The pilot's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as the reality of his downfall settled in. He cast a desperate glance at the crew, but the flight attendants averted their eyes, their faces carefully neutral. No one was coming to his rescue. As Thornton was escorted off the plane, his head bowed and his steps heavy, Naomi turned to Jonathan. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside her. Relief, anger, gratitude, exhaustion. His hand found her shoulder, warm and grounding, a silent promise of protection. "You never have to thank me for standing with you," he replied, his deep voice softening as he met her gaze. He knelt beside her seat, his hand gently covering hers, the calluses on his fingers brushing against her skin. "Are you okay?" She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I am now." His smile was small but genuine, though a flicker of sadness lingered in his eyesrow that she'd had to endure this at all. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his voice thick with regret. Naomi squeezed his hand, her grip firm. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. But we faced it together." As the plane's engines roared to life, Naomi settled into her seat, her fingers tracing the smooth leather armrest. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant streaks of gold and arranged a quiet testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light would always break through. The cabin fell into an uneasy hush, the passengers' murmurs fading as the hum of the engines took over. Jonathan remained beside her, his presence a steady anchor, and for the first time since boarding, Naomi felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. This wasn't just a victory over one man's prejudice, it was a lesson in justice, a stark warning of the consequences that follow when power is wielded carelessly. Thornton's fall wasn't just his own, it was a ripple that would echo through the airline, a call for accountability that wouldn't be ignored. And for Naomi, it was a reminder of her own strength and the unyielding support of the man who stood by her side. Naomi pressed her hand gently against her chest, savoring the fleeting warmth that seemed to seep into her weary soul. For just a heartbeat, she let herself sink into that small comfort, a fragile shield against the storm of emotions that had battered her throughout the day. From her window seat, she could sense the weight of dozens of eyes brushing against her like a soft breeze, some fleeting, some lingering. She stole a quick glance around the cabin, catching a few of those gazes in return. A few were soft and knowing, radiating a quiet camaraderie that felt like a whispered "I understand." Others flickered with hesitation or curiosity, as if the passengers were still piecing together the scene they'd witnessed unfold earlier, unsure whether to applaud or recoil. To Rose's back, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair met her eyes and offered a subtle nod, a gesture so understated yet brimming with respect that it caught her off guard. Across the aisle, a young woman with a messy bun and tired eyes mouthed the words "You're amazing," her lips trembling slightly as if she'd been holding back tears. Naomi managed a faint smile in response and not a victorious grin, but a quiet acknowledgement of their shared moment. Amazing? No, she didn't feel amazing. If anything, she felt hollowed out, as though the fiery surge of adrenaline that had propelled her through the confrontation had drained away, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind sluggish, like a machine winding down after running too hot for too long. The soft click of polished heels approached, hesitant but deliberate, pulling her from her thoughts. A young flight attendant stepped into view, her wide brown eyes darting nervously between Naomi and the man seated across the aisle. Her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, Erica. She clutched her hands tightly in front of her, fingers twisting together as if she were anchoring herself against some unseen tide. "Mrs. Carter," she began, her voice quivering like a leaf caught in the wind. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am for everything. What happened back there, it was completely out of line, and on behalf of the crew, I'm truly sorry." Naomi studied her for a long moment, tracing the lines of Erica's youthful face. There was a raw sincerity in her words, a vulnerability that shone through her nervous fidgeting. But Naomi had long since learned to weigh apologies carefully, not just by the sound of them, but by the deeds that followed. "Thank you," she replied, her tone steady and measured. "I appreciate you taking the time to say that." Erica hesitated, her lips parting as if she expected Naomi to elaborate, to unleash a torrent of anger or demand more than a simple apology. When Naomi offered nothing further, Erica flashed a shaky smile, murmured a quick "excuse me," and retreated down the aisle. As she disappeared toward the galley, Naomi caught the fleeting glance Erica cast toward the cockpit, a quick, anxious flicker that hinted at the upheaval still rippling through the crew. A new pilot had taken over, presumably, but the shadow of Thornton's arrogance hung in the air like a stubborn fog, a reminder that even his absence couldn't erase the mark he'd left. The plane shuddered slightly as it began its slow taxi toward the runway and across the aisle. Jonathan rose from his seat with his usual quiet grace. He settled in beside her, his broad shoulders filling the space as he pulled out his phone to scroll through emails. Naomi watched him for a moment, marveling at the way he carried himself, always poised, always juggling the demands of his world with a resolve that bordered on relentless. His brow furrowed slightly as he read, a telltale sign of the thoughts churning beneath his calm exterior. She often wondered how he managed it, how he kept the plates spinning without ever letting one crash to the ground. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the fading sunlight spilled across the tarmac in rich shades of amber and rose, painting the asphalt in hues that felt almost too beautiful for such a chaotic day. The sight stirred a memorial line from the keynote speech she'd delivered just days ago. "Innovation isn't born from comfort, it's forged in the fires of adversity." She'd penned those words thinking of her career, of the sleepless nights and hard-won victories that had carved her path. But now, They echoed in her chest with a raw, personal weight. She replayed the pilot's voice in her mindest sneering tone. The way he'd dismissed her with assumptions that cut deeper than she cared to admit. He hadn't known her story, her triumphs, the countless hurdles she'd leapt over to claim her place in the world. To him, she was just a seat number, a problem to be dealt with. And that was the crux of Ithis. Wasn't about a seat on a plane. It was about the quiet, grinding battles fought every day by people like her. People forced to prove their worth in spaces they'd already earned. A soft sigh slipped from her lips, barely audible over the hum of the engines. She wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd face prejudice. Knew the world was too stubborn to change overnight. But it had been years since she'd been forced to stare it down so publicly. And the weight of that truth pressed against her ribs like a stone. As the plane climbed into the sky and leveled off at cruising altitude, a gentle tap on her armrest broke her reverie. She turned to find a middle-aged woman from seat 3C standing beside her, balancing a small tray with 2 glasses of champagne. The woman's face was lined with a gentle weariness, but her smile was warm, her gray eyes crinkling at the corners. "I thought you might like this," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "It's on the house here, at least it ought to be." Naomi let out a soft chuckle, accepting the glass with a nod. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." The woman shrugged, setting the second glass on Jonathan's tray table with a casual ease. "It's the least I could do," she said, her tone darkening slightly. "I've seen too much of what you went through today, and I'm tired of keeping quiet. People need to start speaking up." Naomi studied her, searching beyond the surface of her kindness. There was a depth to the woman's gaze, a flicker of exhaustion that hinted at her own unspoken struggles. It was a small gesture, this offering of champagne, but it carried the weight of solidarity, and Naomi felt its warmth settle into her bones. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice soft but genuine. The woman nodded once. A silent pact sealed, then returned to her seat, leaving Naomi to sip the champagne alone. The bubbles danced across her tongue, a fleeting burst of sweetness that felt like a quiet rebellion against the bitterness of the day. As the flight wore on, Jonathan leaned across the aisle, his voice low and deliberate, careful not to disturb the sleeping passengers around them. "Naomi," he said, his tone gentle but edged with steel, "this isn't over." She raised an eyebrow, meeting his steady gaze. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, his words measured but firm. "I mean Thornton and anyone else like him. This isn't just about today. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to you or anyone else ever again." Naomi set her glass down, her fingers tracing the delicate stem as she considered his words. She understood the fire behind them, felt a flicker of gratitude for his unwavering resolve. But beneath that gratitude lay a bone-deep exhaustion, a weariness born from years of fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "I'm grateful for everything you've done. I am. But you can't fix the world in a single night." "No," he agreed, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "But I can start with this airline, and I can make damn sure they know exactly who they're dealing with." His words weren't just a promise to her, they were a vow to every soul who'd ever been diminished, every voice silenced by arrogance or apathy. Naomi nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't have the strength to argue, and deep down, she knew he was right. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through tireless effort. And Jonathan was already rolling up his sleeves. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew bustled through their evening service, and Naomi reclined her seat, letting her eyes flutter shut. The steady drone of the engines wrapped around her like a blanket, lulling her into a fragile doze. As the plane carved its path through the night sky, her thoughts drifted not to the ugliness of the day, but to a distant hope, a world where stories like hers were relics of the past, not chapters still being written. It was a dream, fragile and far off, but it was hers to cradle close. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a constant heartbeat beneath the murmurs of passengers settling in for the night. Naomi sat upright, her empty champagne glass resting on the tray table, her mind too restless to follow her body into sleep. She glanced at Jonathan, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his tablet. Even now, he was working, his sharp features softened by the screen's light. She admired his composure, the way he held steady even when the world tilted off its axis. But she knew him too well to miss the tension simmering beneath his jaw tight, his fingers tapping the screen with a rhythm that betrayed his frustration. Jonathan didn't let wrongs slide. He chased them down, and she knew he wouldn't rest until he'd made this right. Her gaze wandered to the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of ink pierced by faint, twinkling stars. It was beautiful in its enormity, yet unsettling to a reminder of how small her struggles might seem against the sprawl of the universe. But small didn't mean insignificant, not when they carved grooves into her soul, not when they demanded she stand taller than she felt. A soft knock on her armrest startled her, and she turned to find Erica standing there again, this time cradling a steaming cup of tea on a saucer. The young attendant's hands trembled slightly, her wide eyes searching Naomi's face for something approval, perhaps, or forgiveness. "I thought you might like this," Erica said, her voice steady despite the nerves flickering in her posture. "It's chamomile. It might help you relax." Naomi took the cup, the warmth seeping into her palms as she studied Erica's earnest expression. There was a quiet courage in the gesture, a determination shining through her uncertainty. "Thank you," Naomi said, offering a small smile. She didn't have the heart to turn it away, even if her mind buzzed too loudly for tea to tame it. Erica lingered, shifting her weight as if debating whether to flee or speak. "Mrs. Carter," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just wanted to say I really admire how you handled everything earlier. A lot of people would have lost it, but you were so calm. I don't think I could have done that." Naomi tilted her head, caught off guard by the confession. She saw the tremble in Erica's hands, the way her shoulders hunched slightly as if bracing for judgment. There was more to this young woman than met the eye, a flicker of resilience beneath her timid exterior, a spark that might one day blaze brighter than she realized. "Thank you, Erica," Naomi said softly, her words carrying a weight she hadn't intended. "You'd be surprised what you're capable of when you have to be." Erica nodded, a faint flush creeping up her cheeks, then slipped away, leaving Naomi with the tea and a swirl of thoughts. She sipped it slowly, the chamomile's gentle warmth a quiet counterpoint to the day's sharp edges. Thornton's sneering face flashed in her Minda's smug certainty, the way he'd wielded his authority like a blunt weapon. Power, she thought, was a dangerous thing in careless hands. It could lift people up or grind them down, and Thornton had chosen the latter without a second thought. But Justice Sestus was the slow, steady hand that righted the scales. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was patient, persistent, and it demanded accountability. Today had been a lesson in that truth, one she'd carry forward, etched into her bones alongside every other fight she'd endured. As the plane soared through the night, Naomi leaned back, the tea cooling in her hands. She thought of Jonathan's resolve, of Erica's quiet strength, of the woman in 3C who'd refused to stay silent. They were threads in a tapestry she hadn't expected to weave today, proof that even in the face of arrogance and abuse, there were people willing to stand, to speak, to act. And that, she realized, was where change began, not in grand gestures, but in the small, stubborn choices to demand better. The hum of the engines faded into the background as she closed her eyes, holding tight to that fragile, flickering hope. The world wasn't fixed yet, but it wasn't beyond saving either. The air inside the plane felt thick and heavy, a quiet hum threading through the stillness as Naomi cradled her teacup, its warmth seeping into her palms like a faint lifeline. She exhaled softly, her breath trembling just enough to betray the storm of emotion swirling within her ranger. Exhaustion and a fragile thread of gratitude woven through it all. "Sometimes calm is the only choice you have, Erica," the young flight attendant had said earlier, her voice gentle yet weighted with understanding. Naomi had nodded, her lips twitching into a faint, appreciative smile. "Thank you," she'd murmured, her words carrying more depth than she'd intended. "That means a lot." Erica's eyes had softened, a flicker of empathy passing between them before she'd offered, "If you need anything else during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask," and then glided away, her steps light but purposeful down the dimly lit aisle. Naomi tilted her head back against the seat, letting the tea's heat radiate through her chest, a small comfort that dulled the sharp edges of the day's turmoil. Thornton's voice's smug, cutting tone still echoed in her mind, a persistent thorn she couldn't quite dislodge. The kindness from Erica, however fleeting, had been a bomb, a quiet explosion of light against the darkness that had settled over her. As the plane leveled out, its engines purring steadily, she closed her eyes, not expecting sleep, but hoping for a moment of reprieve. The vibrations beneath her seat melded with the low drone of machinery, wrapping her in a cocoon of sound that dulled her racing thoughts. She drifted not fully asleep, but floating in that hazy space where time blurs until a voice broke through the fog. It was Jonathan, her husband, speaking in that low, measured cadence she knew so well. Blinking slowly, Naomi turned her head, her vision sharpening as she spotted him a few rows ahead, leaning toward a woman she recognized as one from Seat 3C, who'd brought them champagne earlier with a polite, practiced smile. Their conversation was hushed, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in the way Jonathan's shoulders tensed, the way the woman's hands moved subtly but deliberately. Naomi's curiosity stirred, tugging her out of her daze. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her, catching her gaze, and with a slight tilt of his head, he beckoned her over. She unbuckled her seatbelt with careful fingers, her body still heavy with the remnants of near sleep, and slid into the empty seat beside him, her movements slow but resolute. "This is Mrs. Patricia Moore," Jonathan said, his voice steady as he gestured to the woman. "She has something you might want to hear." Patricia turned to Naomi, extending a hand with a grip that was firm yet surprisingly warm, her hazel eyes glinting with a mix of resolve and kindness. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carter," she said, her tone smooth but tinged with something deeper. "I hope you don't mind my intruding." Naomi shook her head, settling in beside Jonathan. "Not at all," she replied, her voice soft but curious. "What's this about?" Patricia leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt almost conspiratorial, as if she were sharing a long-guarded secret. "It's about Thornton's captain from earlier." Naomi's muscles tightened instinctively, her breath catching as Patricia's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Go on," Naomi urged, her tone steady despite the unease coiling in her stomach. Patricia sighed, a sound heavy with years of frustration. "I've been flying with this airline for over a decade," she began, her gaze drifting briefly to the window where the night sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass. "And I've watched Thornton pull stunts like that more times than I care to count. It's always subtle, calculated little jabs aimed at people he thinks won't push back. But today he crossed a line. He went too far." Naomi glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, his dark eyes urging her to listen. Patricia straightened, her posture radiating a quiet strength. "I'm a retired HR executive," she continued, her voice gaining an edge of authority. "I've dealt with men like him my whole career, arrogant, entitled types who think they're untouchable. And I'll tell you this, if no one steps up, if no one calls them out, they don't stop. They just get worse." I wanted to say something earlier, but I wasn't sure how it'd land. Now, though, I'm certain. People need to know who he really is. Naomi's mind raced, her fingers tightening around the armrest. What are you suggesting?" she asked, her words careful but laced with a growing intensity. Patricia met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm saying I'll back you up," she replied, her tone resolute. "If you decide to take this further, I'll testify. Give a statement whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't slither away from this again." Naomi's chest swelled, a rush of gratitude mingling with the heavy realization of what this meant. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about justice, about dragging years of Thornton's unchecked behavior into the light. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "That means more than I can express." Patricia's face softened into a warm, reassuring smile. "You're welcome. And for what it's worth, I think you handled yourself brilliantly today." As Patricia returned to her seat, Naomi and Jonathan sat in silence, the cabin's dimmed lights casting long, soft shadows across their faces. The air felt charged, not with dread, but with the quiet tension of a decision looming on the horizon. Naomi stared at the empty teacup on her tray, its faint amber stain glowing faintly under the overhead light. "Do you think she's right?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. About pursuing this, Jonathan turned to her, his brow furrowing as he considered her words. "I think it's your call," he said, his tone thoughtful but firm. "But if you want my take, eyes, she's right. Thornton needs to face consequences, not just for what he did to you, but for everyone he's hurt along the way." Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the teacup as memories flickered through her mind moments when she'd bitten. Her tongue smoothed over conflicts, chosen peace over confrontation. But this time, the weight felt different. This time, she wasn't alone. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Jonathan reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with a steady warmth. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," he promised. She looked at him, her heart swelling with a love so deep it anchored her amidst the chaos. "I know," she whispered, leaning back as the plane carried them through the night, her thoughts a tangled dance of exhaustion and determination. For the first time in hours, a faint spark of hope flickered within her, small, delicate, but enough to keep her going. The hours stretched on, the engine's drone growing louder in the stillness of the early morning. Naomi's teacup sat untouched, a silent witness to her restless mind. She closed her eyes, but sleep remained elusive, her thoughts crashing like waves against a rocky shore. Thornton's behavior wasn't just a personal slight, it was a pattern, a thread of arrogance and abuse woven through years of silence. Patricia's words had ignited something in her, a realization that this fight might ripple beyond her own experience, touching lives she'd never even met. A sudden flurry of movement in the aisle snapped her back to the present. She opened her eyes, her pulse quickening as she saw the flight attendants huddled near the galley, their whispers sharp and urgent. Their faces were tight with worry, their gestures clipped and anxious. Something was wrong. Jonathan noticed it too, lowering his tablet and leaning into the aisle, his brow creasing with concern. He shot Naomi a glance, a silent question hanging between them. She shrugged, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her growing unease. Moments later, Erica approached their row, her face pale and drawn, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. She knelt beside Jonathan, her voice a hushed murmur meant only for them. "Mr. Carter," she began, her eyes darting to Naomi before she pressed on. "I thought you should know Captain Thornton hasn't left the plane yet." Naomi's stomach lurched, a cold dread settling in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with apprehension. Erica swallowed hard, her gaze dropping briefly. "He was supposed to disembark after being relieved of duty, but we just found out he's still in the crew rest area. The new captain told us a few minutes ago." Jonathan's jaw tightened, a shadow darkening his features. Why wasn't he removed immediately? He demanded, his tone low but cutting. Erica hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I think he talked his way into staying. He said he wanted to rest before his next flight." Jonathan surged to his feet, his towering frame suddenly dominating the cramped space. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice a controlled growl. "Where is he now?" Erica flinched slightly but answered quickly, "In the back, near the crew quarters. The cabin supervisor's with him." Naomi reached out, her fingers brushing Jonathan's sleeve, her touch soft but firm. "Wait," she said, her voice a quiet anchor. "Let me come with you." He paused, his eyes searching hers, a storm of frustration and resolve brewing within them. After a beat, he nodded. "Okay, let's handle this together." The rear of the plane was a world apart, the narrow aisles flanked by darkened windows and the soft snores of sleeping passengers. As they approached the crew rest area, the air grew thick with unspoken tension, a charged silence that prickled against Naomi's skin. Thornton sat there, sprawled in a fold-down chair near the galley, his posture infuriatingly relaxed, as if he owned the space. His uniform was slightly rumpled, his arms crossed casually over his chest. When he looked up and saw them, his expression shifted indifference giving way to a flash of irritation, his lips curling into a faint sneer. The cabin supervisor stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of professional restraint tinged with unease. Naomi's heart pounded, but she held her ground, her eyes locking onto Thornton's with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the countless others he'd targeted, the lives he'd diminished with his petty cruelties. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire that had to be kindled, fed by courage and consequence. And in that moment, as the plane hummed steadily beneath her feet, Naomi felt the first embers of that fire begin to burn. The air inside the plane felt thick and heavy, a stifling stillness pressing down on Naomi as she stood with her hands clasped tightly. In front of her, her palms were damp, her fingers trembling faintly from the strain of holding herself together. Her face, lined with unease, betrayed the storm brewing inside here, a mix of anger, exhaustion, and a flicker of something harder to name, something like resolve. Across from her, Thornton Jonathan lounged in his seat, his posture deliberately casual. But there was a sharpness to him that cut through the quiet like a blade. His voice, when he spoke, was crisp and biting, each word laced with an edge that made the cramped cabin feel even smaller. "You were supposed to leave this plane," he said, his dark eyes narrowing as they locked onto her. "Why the hell are you still here?" Naomi's breath caught in her throat, but Thornton didn't wait for her to answer. His lip curled upward, a faint, mocking sneer twisting his features. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to take a break," he drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm so thick it felt like a slap. "Last I checked, I'm still on the payroll for this airline." He leaned back further, crossing his arms over his chest, his uniform slightly wrinkled, but still carrying the authority of his position. There was a smugness to him, a quiet arrogance that seemed to dare anyone to challenge him. Jonathan, her husband, took a step forward, his broad frame filling the narrow space between the seats. His presence was commanding, a steady force that seemed to anchor the chaos swirling around them. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with a controlled fury that Naomi knew all too well. "You're not just any employee," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word heavy with accusation. "You're someone who harassed and humiliated a passenger-me wife, no less, without a shred of reason. And the fact that you're still sitting here, acting like nothing happened, shows you don't give a damn about accountability." Thornton's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, tilting his head as if Jonathan's words were nothing more than a mild annoyance. "You can't fire me," he said coolly, his voice smooth and unyielding. "That's for corporate to decide. And until they do, I've got every right to be on this plane, same as you." He uncrossed his arms, letting his hands rest casually on his knees, as if the conversation were already beneath him. Naomi couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade wrapped in velvet. "This isn't about entitlement," she said, her tone firm but laced with a quiet intensity that made Thornton's eyes flick toward her. "It's about responsibility. You abused your authority, and now you're cowering behind rules and loopholes instead of owning up to what you did." Her heart pounded in her chest as she spoke, each word a release of the frustration she'd been carrying since the moment Thornton had singled her out earlier in the flight. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw something shift in his gaze, a guilt, maybe, or a flicker of fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same infuriating mask of indifference. Before Thornton could fire back with another quip, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the galley. Patricia Moore stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face etched with a sternness that seemed to carry the weight of years. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, but her posture radiated a quiet strength that demanded attention. She'd clearly overheard every word of the exchange, and the fire in her eyes suggested she wasn't about to let it slide. "Thornton," she said, her voice deep and resonant, cutting through the air with an authority that made even the cabin supervisor straighten up. "You've been coasting on that arrogance of yours for years, but this time, you've gone too far. You can't charm or argue your way out of this one." Thornton's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he turned to face her. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, his tone sharp with defiance. Patricia didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, her presence filling the small space like a storm rolling in. "I'm someone who's seen enough people like you bullies hiding behind badges and less to know exactly what you're trying to pull," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "This little show of bravado, it's not going to save you, not this time." The tension in the cabin grew almost unbearable, a thick, suffocating weight pressing down on everyone inside. Naomi glanced at Jonathan, who stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Thornton with an intensity that was impossible to read. Was it anger, satisfaction? She couldn't tell, but she knew he was waiting, watching, ready to act if the situation demanded it. Thornton's confidence seemed to waver under the combined scrutiny, his shoulders hunching slightly as the cracks in his facade began to show. The cabin supervisor, a young woman with wide eyes and a nervous tremble in her hands, finally found her voice. Emboldened by Patricia's presence, she stepped forward, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Captain Thornton," she said, her tone shaky but firm, "I've already reported this incident to the airline's executive office. You should have been off this flight the moment Mr. Carter stepped in." Her words hung in the air, a quiet declaration that shifted the balance of power. Thornton opened his mouth, his lips parting as if to argue, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the weight of the supervisor's words, or the unyielding stares boring into him from every direction. Whatever it was, he closed his mouth again, his shoulders slumping just enough to reveal the uncertainty he'd been hiding. Jonathan took another step closer, his voice dropping to a low, resolute murmur that seemed to echo in the stillness. "This isn't just about what happened tonight, Thornton. It's about a pattern of way you've carried yourself that has no place here or anywhere. You can't outrun it anymore." Thornton looked away, his jaw clenching so tightly Naomi could see the muscles twitch beneath his skin. For the first time, she caught a glimpse of something raw in his eyes, defeat, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his reign of unchecked power was crumbling. The cabin supervisor squared her shoulders, her nerves giving way to a newfound authority. "Captain Thornton," she said, her voice steady now, "I'm instructing you to stay in the crew rest area for the rest of this flight. When we land, security will escort you to the airline's disciplinary office. Any further resistance will mean immediate termination." Thornton didn't respond. His silence was heavy, a reluctant surrender that spoke louder than any protest could have. As the group began to disperse, Naomi felt a weight lift from her chest, a lightness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She and Jonathan turned to head back to their seats, his hand brushing against hers in a fleeting, unspoken promise of solidarity. They'd face this together, and they'd keep standing side by side, no matter how long the fight for justice stretched ahead. For the first time since takeoff, Naomi let herself breathe deeply, her eyes drifting to the window where the stars glimmered against the endless black. Their light felt sharper now, a quiet testament that even in the darkest moments, hope could still break through. The cabin lights had dimmed as the night wore on, the hours slipping into the early morning. Outside, the world was a vast, unbroken sea of darkness, pierced only by the faint, distant glow of stars. Inside, a fragile stillness settled over the plane, a delicate balance of exhaustion and lingering tension. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the faint tremor in her fingers finally starting to fade. Thornton's smug face still lingered in her mind, a vivid reminder of how deeply arrogance could root itself when no one dared to pull it up. But beneath the weariness, there was a spark of triumph. His voice had been silenced, his power stripped away, if only for now. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, a step toward something bigger than herself. Jonathan sat across the aisle, his tablet abandoned on the tray table, its screen dark. He'd been watching her, his gaze soft but steady, the way he always did when he was trying to read her without pushing. When their eyes met, he offered her a small, familiar smile of kind that warmed her even on the coldest days, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this. "Do you want to talk?" he asked, his voice gentle, barely above a whisper. Naomi shook her head, her lips curving into a tired but genuine smile. "Not yet," she said softly. "I think I just need to sit with it for a little while." Jonathan nodded, his expression softening further, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Take your time," he murmured, settling back into his seat. The cabin was hushed, most passengers lost in sleep or their own private worlds. The faint clink of glassware from the galley and the soft shuffle of the flight crew moving through the aisles were the only sounds breaking the silence. Naomi sipped the last of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest like a soothing balm against the raw edges of her emotions. Sleep tugged at her, a gentle pull she was almost ready to give in to. When a shadow fell across her seat, she looked up to see Patricia Moore standing there, a small folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. Her expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of warmth in her eyes, a quiet strength that made Naomi sit up a little straighter. "May I?" Patricia asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Naomi nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Of course," she said, shifting slightly to make room. Patricia settled in, smoothing her skirt over her knees with a deliberate grace. She unfolded the paper and handed it to Naomi, who took it with a mix of apprehension and intrigue. The handwriting was neat, the lines precise, and as Naomi read, her brows furrowed, the weight of the words sinking in slowly. It wasn't a simple note of support or a casual thank you. It was a detailed record of Thornton's behavior on past flights, a timeline of incidents Patricia had witnessed firsthand. Some were small, easily brushed off as lapses in judgment, a curt word here, an impatient gesture there, but others were damning gun-just accusations, snide comments dripping with prejudice, passengers quietly asking to be moved to different flights after crossing his path. Patricia broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to you," she admitted, her eyes searching Naomi's face. "But after what I saw tonight, I knew it wasn't enough to just stand by anymore. People like him, they feed off silence, off people looking the other way." Naomi set the note in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if testing its reality. It felt heavy, not just in her hands, but in her Sula collection of buried truths finally brought to light. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. This could change everything." Patricia gave a small nod, a flicker of resolve in her gaze. "Use it however you think is right," she said. "I just wanted you to know you're not the only one fighting this." For the first time that night, Naomi felt a surge of hope, and not just for herself, but for everyone who'd suffered under Thornton's shadow without a voice. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her purse, where it felt like a weapon, a shield, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. As Patricia returned to her seat, Naomi leaned back, her mind racing. The note wasn't just evidence. It was a call to action, a reminder that justice wasn't a solitary pursuit. She'd spent so much of her life fighting alone, carrying burdens she thought were hers to bear. But this time, it was different. There were others, people who'd been wronged, people who'd been silenced, and now she held something that could speak for them all. Jonathan shifted in his seat, catching her eye. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question. "Are you okay?" Naomi gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a faint, determined smile. "I think I am," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The stars outside burned brighter, and for the first time, she felt the weight of their light not as a distant hope, but as a fire she could carry forward. The cabin of the plane was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines cutting through the night sky. Naomi sat by the window, her breath fogging faintly against the cold glass as she murmured, "I know what I need to do." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that seemed to fill the space between her and Jonathan, who sat across the narrow aisle. His sharp features softened at her words, his eyes catching the dim overhead light as he leaned slightly toward her. "Whatever it is," he said, his tone steady and warm, "you've got me every step of the way." Naomi's hand trembled just a little as she reached out, her fingertips brushing his in a fleeting, tender gesture. That simple touch was like an anchor, tethering her to the man who had stood by her through storms she never thought they'd weather together. "I know," she replied, her voice catching with gratitude, "and that's more than enough." As the hours stretched on, Naomi's gaze drifted to the window. The stars outside glittered like 1,000 unblinking eyes, watching her wrestle with the tangle of thoughts spinning through her mind. She replayed the confrontation with Thornton, his smug face, his dismissive tone, the way he wielded his authority like a club. Then there was Patricia's note, a crumpled scrap of paper now tucked safely in her purse, its words etched into her memory like a call to arms. She thought, too, of the passengers who had filled the seats around her during that tense showdown. A few had murmured words of encouragement, their voices soft but sincere. Most, though, had averted their eyes, shrinking into their seats as if Thornton's bluster might somehow spill over onto them. Naomi didn't blame them, not entirely. Fear was a heavy chain, one that locked people in place when they most wanted to stand. But she couldn't shake the bitter realization that their silence wasn't free. It came with a price, one she'd paid tonight in the ache of her chest and the fire in her gut. Jonathan's voice sliced through the stillness, low and grounding. "You're thinking about what's next, aren't you?" She turned to him, her eyes sharp with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Yeah," she admitted, letting the word hang for a moment before adding, "but it's bigger than that. It's about making it mean something, making sure this doesn't just fade into nothing." He nodded, slow and deliberate, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed her words. "You've already set it in motion," he said, standing up to him, refusing to let it slide. "You've planted something. Now it's about helping it grow." His words hit her like a gust of fresh air, clearing the fog in her mind. This wasn't just about Thornton, that petty tyrant in a captain's uniform. It was about the rotting system that propped him up, letting him trample over people like her without a second thought. The road ahead loomed long and steep, but as she met Jonathan's steady gaze, she felt a spark of determination flare within her. "I'll need you with me," she said, her voice quiet but edged with steel. He smiled, a warm, quiet pride lighting his face. "You've got me, always." The first tendrils of dawn began to seep into the sky, painting the horizon in soft strokes of gold and pink. Naomi watched the transformation, the way the darkness didn't just vanish but retreated, step by reluctant step, before the unstoppable advance of light. It felt like a mirror to her own path, a quiet promise that even the bleakest moments couldn't hold forever. As the plane dipped toward the runway, a calm settled over her, wrapping around her like a blanket. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the first page of a story she was ready to write. Her fingers brushed the edge of Patricia's note in her purse, its texture rough against her skin. It was a small thing, but it carried the weight of a vow, a chance to turn the tide, to reshape a narrative that had gone unchallenged for too long. She glanced at Jonathan, her voice firm as she said, "Let's make this right." He squeezed her hand, his grip solid and sure. "Together," he replied, and the word felt like a pact sealed in stone. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the wheels kissing the tarmac in a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Around them, passengers stirred, bleary-eyed and stiff, reaching for bags or stretching cramped limbs. Naomi felt the night's events still clinging to her like damp clothes, but that flicker of hope inside her burned brighter now, a steady flame against the shadows. As Jonathan stood to retrieve their carry-ons from the overhead bin, his movements were smooth and unhurried, a silent reminder that they were in this as a unit. Naomi smoothed her blazer, the fabric cool beneath her palms, and rose to her feet. Across the aisle, Patricia Moore caught her eye. The older woman's nod was sharp and deliberate, a wordless message that pulsed with conviction. "You've got this." Naomi held her gaze for a moment, drawing strength from that quiet solidarity. The cabin doors swung open, and the shuffle of disembarking began. Naomi hesitated, her eyes scanning the rows ahead. Thornton was still on this plane somewhere, likely lingering in the cockpit, waiting for the crowd to thin so he could slink away unnoticed. A part of her burned to march up there, to drag him into the open and demand he face the mess he'd made. But a quieter, wiser voice held her back. This wasn't the place for justice, and not yet. The real fight would happen higher up, in the boardrooms and policy manuals where men like Thornton were either reined in or set loose. She stepped into the aisle, Jonathan at her side, and together they moved into the terminal. The fluorescent lights glared down, harsh and unforgiving after the muted cabin. But Naomi stood tall beneath them. They hadn't taken 10 steps before a man approached, his suit crisp and his expression tight with practiced remorse. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice measured. "I'm Peter Reynolds, Regional Operations Manager for SkyConnect Airlines. I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what happened on your flight. We take these matters very seriously, and I assure you there will be an immediate investigation." Jonathan stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared, his presence filling the space. "An investigation's not enough," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "This isn't some one-off fluke. Captain Thornton's behavior is a symptom of something rotten in your company, something That needs real, thorough action, not just a slap on the wrist. Reynolds shifted, his polished demeanor faltering under the weight of Jonathan's words. I understand your frustration, Mr. Carter, and I assure you, you don't understand, Naomi cut in, her voice steady as a blade. This isn't about frustration. It's about a system that lets people like Thornton abuse their power without consequence. If you want to fix this, apologies won't cut it. You need to act. Reynolds blinked, clearly rattled by her unflinching clarity. What do you propose? He asked, his tone cautious but curious. Naomi glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a faint, encouraging nod. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on Reynolds. I propose you dig into Thornton's, record every complaint, every incident. Set up a process that actually listens to passengers, not just brushes them aside. And make sure every single employee, from pilots to baggage handlers, gets training on bias and accountability. That's where you start. Reynolds swallowed, his polished mask slipping. That's a big ask. He said slowly, it's the least you can do. Jonathan shot back, his voice firm. And as a shareholder, I'll make damn sure it happens. Reynolds nodded, a flicker of something like respect crossing his face. I'll take this to the top, he said, then turned and strode away. Naomi let out a long breath, the knot in her chest loosening just a fraction. Jonathan's hand settled on her back, warm and grounding. You were incredible, he murmured. She managed a tired smile. I just said what had to be said. He shook his head, his eyes shining with admiration. No, you did more. You showed them what strength looks like. She glanced around the terminal, the crowd flowing past like a river oblivious ordinary. To them, this was just another day. To her, it was a fault line, a moment that split her life into before and after. Then she heard a sharp clip of boots on tile. Thornton emerged from the gate, flanked by 2 security guards. His face was ashen, the cocky smirk gone, replaced by a tightness that might have been shame or just dread. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, he faltered. Naomi held his stare, her expression serene but unyielding. She didn't need to speak. Her silence roared louder than any accusation. You don't get to walk away unscathed. As Thornton was escorted off, Naomi felt a door close enough, fully, not yet, but enough to let her breathe. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and late-night strategy sessions. She and Jonathan worked shoulder to shoulder with SkyConnect's leadership, holding them to the promises Reynolds had made. Patricia Moore stepped forward too, her testimony a damning litany of Thornton's misdeeds, each detail a nail in the coffin of his career. The airline rolled out changes training programs, a new complaint system, a public pledge to root out bias. Thornton was fired, his record stained with the truth he'd tried to bury. But for Naomi, the real victory was in the voices that followed hers. Passengers came forward, their stories piling up like stones in a cairn, each one a testament to the power of speaking out. Justice wasn't just a gavel strike, it was a slow, steady wave, washing away the old to make room for something better. Months later, Naomi stood at a podium, the warm glow of conference lights bathing her face. She was delivering the keynote she'd planned before that fateful flight, her voice ringing clear and strong. Adversity doesn't just test us, she said, her words weaving through the hushed room. It dares you to arise, to speak, to shape the world we want. In the front row, Jonathan watched, his quiet pride a steady anchor. He'd been her rock through every battle, her partner in rewriting the rules. As she scanned the audience, she felt the weight of their shared journey, not hers alone, but theirs together. The fight wasn't over, but it was theirs to win. Later, on a flight for a long overdue vacation, Naomi settled into her seat, the first-class cabin a stark contrast to that night of reckoning. The crew greeted them with genuine warmth, their smiles a quiet nod to the change she'd helped spark. As the plane climbed into the sky, she gazed out at the endless clouds, their edges gilded by the sun. The road ahead stretched far, but for once, she felt light and burdened, whole. The sky wasn't a ceiling anymore. It was a horizon, vast and open, whispering of possibility. Justice didn't always come fast, but when it landed, it left echoes proof that one voice, raised for what's right, could ripple out and shake the world.